This is episode 187. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and you listening to the Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. I always strive to bring you diverse perspectives on every environmental story and examine their ecological, social, and political dimensions. And today is another episode, sort of from the farming series, where I talk with farmers about farming and conservation. And our guest is Elise Sutton, who is a stock person at the Cherry Lodge farm, where they're running English Longhorn cattle. They're also running sheep, and they're producing what they called biodiverse beef, high quality biodiverse beef. And the reason they call it that way is because they're maintaining rich biodiverse grasslands, and they're using a technique called conservation grazing to maintain those grasslands. So we are going to talk about this, obviously how that farm works and all the challenges. We're going to talk about soil health, dung beetles, worms, but also I asked Elise how they're doing that, from a business perspective, how they maintaining that farm viable economically while taking care of the environment, taking care of those grasslands, all those endangered species, etc. So if you're into farming or into conservation, or the interface of farming and conservation and how farming relates to biodiversity is something that interests you, that episode is the one that you can't miss. So I think that introduction tells you exactly what to expect from this episode. And so I'm not going to be dragging this any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, Elise Sutton. Elise, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure for me to speak with you, and thank you for accepting the invitation. We are going to talk about farming. This is another of my farming episodes. But before we jump into the ever interesting subjects, could you please give us a short introduction, who you are, what you do, and how you got into farming?
Okay, so I grew up in South Dorset, and I originally was never going to set into a career in farming. I absolutely hated cows and being outdoors. And I went to my local agricultural college when I turned 17 and did a course in countryside management. And that's what I really kind of got hooked on, being outdoors and nature conservation and being working with livestock and farming. So sort of doors opened from then on, and I went to university and studied countryside management again. And from there, I really developed my skill set and my love for conservation grazing and native breed livestock, which has led for me to now be working for Natural England and as their stock person at Cherry Lodge Farm, which is home to Parsonage Down National Nature Reserve. So I'm very fortunate to be working there with a herd of English Longhorn cattle. We have a flock of sheep that come in the winter. So I have a very versatile role, from main farming duties to a lot of kind of conservation, species conservation. So it's very, very versatile, and I absolutely love my job. It's very, very rewarding. And I definitely think when 10 years ago when I sat in college looking at a projector thinking, oh my goodness, well, where am I going to go with my career? I wouldn't have thought that's where I would be 10 years later and doing what I am now. So I'm very fortunate to be in the job and the role that I've got.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that, and I can tell that you're enjoying the work you do, because it's livestock farming and conservation in one.
Yes. So it's a difficult balance, I would say. Livestock farming in the UK and worldwide is under continuous pressure and sort of ever scrutinized, and is something that we are trying to really champion on the farm. As we can produce really good quality food, but also conserve nature. We can keep these biodiverse grasslands and the flora and fauna and everything else associated with it. We can find that balance. And the farm was a traditional mixed farm back in the 30s. There was a lot of chemicals used, inorganic nitrogen used, and now we've sort of made this push to really align with Natural England objectives and say, okay, let's think about this. What are we doing? And it's now a lot more nature friendly farming. It's really orientated around the the biodiverse grasslands that we've got and producing what we like to call biodiverse beef from it. So it's been a real challenge, and it's still on an evolving journey, but I relish that challenge, and I'm very excited to see where the farm sort of is heading, and has made some really good big steps already in that hopefully positive direction.
For sure. Paint us a picture. How does a farm look like? What is the biodiversity on a farm?
So it's a 650-acre farm on the southern edge of Salisbury Plain. So our neighbours are the Ministry of Defence and also Stonehenge. So it's a landscape that's full of culture, really. It's really big rolling hills, big open landscapes, not many trees. We've got small areas of scrub, but predominantly these big wide open areas of chalk grassland. So the total area of the farm is dominated by the SSSI, so Site of Special Scientific Interest, which is Parsonage Down. So it was designated back in 1980 for its biodiversity in its flora. So we've got some very rare plant species like the early gentian. We are home to the burnt tip orchid, which we are one of the largest strongholds in Northwest Europe actually for it. So we've got all this makeup of plant species that only can survive through the grazing using large herbivores, so sheep and cattle. And the landscape typically was grazed by sheep. It was a very sheep-dominated landscape, and those sheep would move on quite regularly, like kind of as they would in the wild, moving on as a rotation. So, but now the landscape has moved towards cattle. Cattle are more profitable, there's more money in them. So the herd of longhorns has sort of always been there. They've been there since 1939. And we are very privileged to manage the oldest herd of longhorns that's still registering females every year. So there's a lot of history of the landscape, but a lot of history about the farm and the herd. So the longhorns have always worked on the landscape, and we sort of treat it as one big area. So the management of the grassland is through the cattle and through the sheep in the winter, but it's not just for the plants. We've got some rare butterflies like the marsh fritillary and the Adonis blue. So it can be really challenging trying to balance grazing for the plant species, but also grazing for the butterfly species and the farmland birds that we've got. So you want a real mosaic of different habitats and different areas. And we're a fully organic farm. We went organic in 2019, and we're just going through our Pasture for Life accreditation. So it means we're a fully pasture-fed farm. We can market our beef that way. And it just means that, we really care about the soils. We really care about animal welfare. And we're trying to give, those animals and the environment the best chance, that they can, really. So it's a big change from what the farm previously was, which was quite intensive. There was a lot of arable, and the SSSI wasn't grazed as it should be. We were starting to lose the favourable condition of the grassland. We were seeing species decline, and actually now we've really made the effort to try and improve the grassland, and we're seeing species come back. So our early gentian, for the last sort of 5 years, we've had 1 or 2, and years we've had none. This year, we've had 60 plants, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a massive increase. And it really means a lot to myself and the team to actually bring this species back and see the grassland thriving. And at the moment, it's just full of colour. The dropwort, the lady's bedstraw, bird's foot trefoil, it's all like yellow and white. It's a really beautiful landscape before it sort of changes into its purple phase with the knapweed and the scabious. And then obviously it goes into winter, and it's a whole different environment when it's in the middle of the winter. It's when the wind blows, it really blows and you feel it. And it's not very pleasant out there sometimes, but the cows really suit the landscape, and it's a really lovely area when you link up with the rest of Salisbury Plain. And it's definitely a different area. It's not something you see quite often in the UK, such a large expanse of habitat of chalk grasslands. So I feel very privileged to be managing a little chunk of it.
So if I understand correctly, the originally farm was split into 2 blocks. One was a nature reserve and the other one was farm. And then you decided to merge the two. So can you walk us through the process of the thought process of arriving at that decision and then, implementing that decision? Was there any anxiety that, you're going to destroy the nature reserve area or
So the way it was previously managed was that, it was a farm. It needed to be seen to be making income, which meant stocking very heavily, lots of cattle, but not necessarily on the nature reserve. They weren't grazing that. They were spending a lot of the time in the paddocks, in the, the more productive grassland, to say, or there's a lot of time in the cattle sheds. Over winter they'd be spending 6 months in the cattle shed. So that meant species condition and the habitat condition was declining because it wasn't getting the grazing that was necessarily needed. So I think in the last sort of 10 years, the farm has moved on this trajectory where we need to think together and they can't be two separate entities. So we did away with the arable and we said, let's put everything down to pasture. Let's start producing some really good quality hay and silage for the cattle, start finishing our own cattle on site rather than sending a lot of them off to market, and sell beef off farm. And it's sort of all aligned really that they can go hand in hand and we can produce a really good quality cattle off, these poor quality grasslands, they're naturally nutrient poor. And actually they are nutrient poor, but the cows always come off the down looking really well. The coats are glossy, the calves have grown well, they're fit and they're healthy. And they've got all these species that they're, able to graze and browse on are helping them. So a lot of them are natural wormers. Things like bird's foot trefoil is a natural wormer. So because we're thinking more holistically about how we manage the cattle, they're just getting on with it. We don't have to treat them for any sort of parasites or worms. They just do their own thing, and as they should do in nature. So the way that we manage the Triple SI now, the nature reserve, that's at the heart of everything we do. We'll try and graze that for as long as possible, get it in the condition it needs to. But then all the other kind of 250 acres that we have outside of the Triple SI that surrounds it is kind of matches it, is sympathetic to it. So it's down to grass, and whether that's hay meadow or herbal lay or permanent pasture. So it's not all just suddenly lovely chalk grassland and then very stark monoculture arable. That's our neighbours to the south. It is just, they'll plough right up to our border and it's arable and they spray off. Whereas everything to the north is, is down to grassland, and then our neighbours are also grassland. So it's a real mixed bag, and it's such a stark comparison between our farm and the neighbour's farm. So yeah, trying to manage more holistically and thinking everything as a whole, and making sure the animals stay out on the nature reserve for as long as possible, and producing good quality forage that is got the same species. So we'll try and have a biodiverse hay product or biodiverse silage product that the cows or the calves have over winter. So it's similar to the down. They don't come on to something that's just ryegrass that is, intensively made, and it will go through them very quickly and it's not really helping them. So, they get for the calves, a really good species rich hay, gets their gut going, they're ruminating early and better, and they're being these really good grazers hopefully coming forward. So it's been a challenge for sure. And going organic in 2019 and now producing organic stock, like we farmed organically for a long time, and it just made sense for us to be accredited. And now it opens a few doors for our beef production that we can market it as organic. So it's definitely been difficult, but it's now a much better farm as a whole in encapsulating everything.
I guess this is also must be tremendous quality of beef that you're producing, because one of the things that I read somewhere is like really the beef from cattle that is being fed corn and all the dewormers and all these things, it changes the hormonal balance of the animals in the subtle ways, and they're producing the fat they're laying is kind of different. And then we eat that, and that fat gets to our brain tissue and so on, and this cycle. So I would imagine the beef is excellent quality, and you mentioned you're not using warmers. Probably also hoofs doesn't need to be trimmed that often.
Yeah, so I mean, the Longhorn as a breed are very hardy. They will typically, you can put them out in the grassland and they will just do their thing. They'll get on with it. They are, as a breed, now very well known in rewilding and conservation grazing setups. You look at like the Knepp estate over in Sussex, they've done a big area of rewilding using Longhorns, and that's really promoted the breed and the name. So, and ours will use their horns to bring down trees so they can browse on them. They will also, when there's a hormonal balance and change and dominance in different hierarchies, they will use their horns kind of like deer would in rutting. They will use them, and it's It's always a little bit terrifying when you do see them fight with some big horns. You hope that they don't cause an injury to each other. But they use it on their calves. So when their calves are born, they'll use their horns to sort of pick the calf up and encourage them over to feed. So they exhibit a lot of naturalistic behaviours, which I think in some farming systems you won't see. They are free to do what they want. They'll roam, the triple SI is broken into four compartments, and the smallest one is something about 80 acres. The biggest one is about 200 acres. So they can roam properly. And, you'll see them make the little cow tracks that are permanently going between the water troughs or their favourite area of shade. And they also create they've got a lot of anthills, yellow meadow anthills, thousands and thousands of them, which makes it very challenging driving across the grassland without beaching yourself on these tall anthills. But my favourite thing is because they're full of the ants and the larvae, the badgers particularly love them. So you'll see where the badgers have been trying to get in. And then the cows will smell the fresh dirt. And what they love more than anything is to rub their faces on the anthill. And they'll rub their faces. And I think it's just when the hormonal balance changes, they're trying to show off basically to each other. And the bulls do it as well. They will rub on the anthill, and then they usually will get their horns underneath it and flip the anthill up. And then they will basically drag their hooves on it and flick it up on themselves and cover themselves with the mud. And I've not seen many other herds do that. I don't know if it's a Longhorn thing or if it's just the way that we run our system, but it fascinates me that they do that and they're allowed to exhibit these, behaviours that, the bison in America must do the same thing. These, the big roaming herds. But yeah, because they're out grazing all the time and they're on, chalk grassland's quite firm. They do naturally wear down their feet. So it's only a handful of cows that will trim every year, and that's only a little bit. So they do mind their own business. You have to trim a couple of horns sometimes as well that grow a little bit too close to their face. But, if that was in the wild, that'd be natural selection and they would be naturally culled. So, Longhorns will go up, they'll go backwards, they'll come around and meet at their face. So there's a couple of them we do have to trim about once a year with a little cheese wire and take it back. But they are free to do their own thing. And as I said, it definitely reflects in the quality of the beef because they're not stressed and they can browse what they want. And that biodiverse diet makes up, the different fatty acids, the omega-3, the omega-6 that is produced in it. And Longhorns are known for their intramuscular fat. There's a lot of cattle breeds where if they're pushed too hard, they will just put the kind of fat cap on. It won't go in with the meat. So the intramuscular fat in Longhorns is quite well known. And that usually when you cook it, just sort of melts away and adds to the flavour. So we've had lots of positive feedback from our customers that absolutely, rant and rave about it, which makes me very happy to hear that they're happy with their beef. I think our beef is obviously far superior than everyone else's, but that's just me being very biased.
I believe you. So the big part of a success is the Longhorn cattle. In which way they're special? Because they're so hardy and they can stay the whole year round on the pasture. So in other, more typical breeds of cattle, that wouldn't work, I presume.
So yeah, the Longhorns have been there since the 1930s, and we were a small herd, and it was very much just have a couple of them because they liked keeping them. So the original farmer who bequeathed the farm to Natural England was one of three or one of five breeders who kept the breed going when they almost died out. And ever since, we've expanded and sort of grown the numbers. But we also ran what we call a commercial herd, which was a mix of several different breeds that we brought up, reared, finished, sold on very quickly. And they never did as well as the Longhorns. The Longhorns it took a little bit longer to get the fat on and finish to a suitable weight, but they just naturally did better. You didn't have to put as many inputs in with them. And I think we could trial a lot of different native breeds to the UK, but I think the Longhorn has, for us, really worked. And we've, over the years, because we've got decades and decades of breeding and different genetics, we've really tried to tap in on the grass-fed genetics. So picking animals that produce a calf every year, so they're very fertile, and you'll see a number of lines, so lots of daughters of one cow, of several cows in our herd, because they produce a calf every year. They don't need a lot of input, and they also put on like fat and flesh really easily. So they do well off pasture, basically, which some other breeds would say would melt away. you'd put them out there and you'd think, oh no, I think we need to bring them back on and feed them a bit of hay or something to keep them going. So we will finish all of our beef outdoors and just on grass or like a bit of hay in the winter. And that's it. There's no other inputs at all with them. So what you see is what you get. Just as being selective in choosing the genetic traits is kind of a large part of it. And Longhorns have just sort of worked for us. I can't see us necessarily moving away from the breed when we've had them for so long. And I mean, they look great. More than anything, they look absolutely amazing. I walk across the top of the hill and they look like kind of the Salisbury Plain bison, really. They look very prehistoric being out there.
Yeah, that's for sure. We can attach a few photos of this cattle for the image, for the header image, maybe for on this episode.
Definitely.
At least explain the conservation grazing. What is conservation grazing? You mentioned earlier that grazing was needed for maintaining biodiversity. So for people who usually hear that grazing is bad, everything is overgrazed, we need to take off the sheep, we need to, reduce the herd of cattle. Could you explain conservation grazing and why it's needed?
Conservation grazing is the use of livestock to fulfill conservation objectives. So it's quite popular now. You'll see lots of sites, nature reserves across the UK being grazed, whether that's with cattle, sheep, ponies. You'll see pigs and goats in some situations, but typically you'll see cattle, and the use of them is basically to remove the dominant vegetation. A lot of these habitats are incredibly sensitive, and there's always some sort of dominant species, typically grass, that is most likely to outcompete a lot of the species that are threatened. So for us, we have to remove a lot of the grassing to allow the wildflowers to come up. And that's the case whether that's heathland, in woodland, the use of cattle, but also with pigs to move the soil over and allow, to create a natural understory. And we're basically imitating what large herbivores would be doing. So for us, the cows will push through the scrub, they'll push through the hawthorn and open up the glades and create these edge habitats, which is ideal for butterflies. And you'll see a lot of organisations now either using graziers, so a farmer who's got stock who will bring animals on, or for us, we own the site and we own the stock, so we have a bit more flexibility, and there are sort of constraints with it. So the National Trust, Natural England, RSPB might say, can you bring on 10 cows for X amount of time of the year on 10 acres? And that's how it works. It can be quite prescriptive, but that's more just to get the objectives done. You need to open up this habitat or remove this certain vegetation so that, another species can thrive. And yeah, you'll see lots of different breeds and lots of different habitats being grazed. And for me, I feel quite passionate about it because often enough, you'll see rare breeds and native breeds being used. So the Rare Breeds Survival Trust is a great organisation that's been working to make sure that the UK's native breeds across all species of livestock are maintained and don't go extinct. And, Longhorns were one of them. But because a lot of our native breeds are incredibly hardy, they don't need the inputs, and you can just throw them out there and look after them a little bit, but they will do what they need to do. There's been a real resurgence in the use of these rarer breeds, and a lot of them have come back from being quite endangered. And that's basically, a lot of it is down to conservation grazing. So people have bought these very hardy breeds of sheep and cattle and pigs to put on conservation grazing setups. And that's allowed, more populations more herds and more flocks to appear, which has actually saved a lot of the breeds, which is really great. And, that's one of the reasons why Longhorns are doing really well now, because they're being used in lots of conservation grazing settings. So we are quite a big conservation grazing outfit, with a 650 acre farm. That's quite unusual, really. You'll probably see quite a lot of small sites, less than sort of 20 acres, very small little isolated pockets. But having a couple of cattle in there to fulfill those objectives, can massively improve the habitat condition and changes the game. So it's a fine art. You don't want too many cattle, you don't want to overstock, you don't want to overgraze it. And we find that the cows do really well, but the sheep only come in the winter because they don't want to graze the wildflowers. We don't want to graze the orchids out that we've got. So the sheep, I would say the cattle are the maintainers of the habitat and the sheep are the creators of a habitat. And I know sheep can be really demonized because they're overgrazed, there's lots of them, but for short grassland, it's so important for removing last year's growth of grass and opening up the sward and allowing, bare patches of soil to come up. So it's a real balance and symbiotic relationship with the land that they have by having livestock on. So you'll see so many different breeds of livestock out grazing on different conservation grazing sites now, and it's really lovely to see that these breeds are doing well because people want to graze and use them when they could easily be extinct if it wasn't for conservation.
They appreciate the breeds. Elise, tell me, what is your assessment of the situation? You're obviously running very successful food production and biodiversity operation. What is your assessment of the situation where farming is portrayed as the biggest threat to biodiversity? Maybe not only portrayed, but there's a lot of people even in the farming community who agree that farming is the biggest problem and biggest cause of biodiversity. At the same time, examples like yours says like, well, no, we can have both. What is your assessment? Is farming community going into that direction, or is it still more needs to be done? Or maybe those narratives are a little over the board? Just curious your point of view.
I think the way that I feel like farming is going is with the change in subsidies, with the move to sort of the environmental land management schemes and the use of the sustainable farming incentives. So farmers will be in the future being paid to, create habitat, maintain habitat, think more environmentally and sustainably. Because of that, it has caused a lot of change and a lot of talk about it, because change in subsidies means they have to think differently. And for farmers that have been, hate to say it, stuck in their ways for a very long time, it might work for them, but things are changing and adapting. We've got to farm differently to produce the food that we do. You've got to work with the different seasons. We've had an incredibly wet summer, an incredibly wet winter. And for some people, they're really on the back foot. A lot of arable farmers are struggling because they can't get the crops in the ground, or livestock are in the shed for much longer, or they can't. Not everyone can outwinter like we do. Not everyone's as fortunate to be on lovely chalk grass and that's free draining. They might be on heavy clay. So I think there is a general push, and there's more people talking about it. There's more people talking about resilient farming and regenerative farming, which actually is thinking about the soils and thinking about the environment. There is that, but there's still a lot to work on. There's still a lot of river pollution. There's still a lot of unfavourable farming to tackle. There's a lot that need to be improved. And I'm quite excited to say that I think the next generation of young farmers are thinking about that. They're much more environmentally minded. They're thinking more sustainably about, diversifying their farm, making it a more resilient farm, because they can't just rely on the beef or the sheep that they produce now, or the crops. They've got to think of everything as a whole and how they're going to make money. And it's never been harder to be a farmer. There's so much against the farming community at the moment, whether that's different agendas or how people feel about farming, or just generally trying to be out on the land. It's, Mother Nature's got lots of things to say. And I do think farming is moving in a more sustainable direction, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take a long time for people to be on board. And it's got to be the support of the farming community and the government and subsidies, and people just being genuinely open to diversifying and thinking about how can we actually maximize what we get out of the beef production. But is it the most efficient to be having them in the cattle sheds 6 months of the year and feeding and feeding and feeding? Can we do things like bale grazing? Can we rotationally graze with the pastures? Should we change breed? Should we think about a different breed? There's lots and lots to contend with. And I'm very fortunate to be friends with very good farmers that are leading the way in, this kind of nature-friendly farming and showing that it can be done well, and they're making money, they're making a profit on it. but they're not sapping everything out of the soil. Their livestock look really well and healthy. Their yields are really good with their crops. And I think it's just getting that voice out there and telling people. And I think for me, getting off farm to meet other farmers and go to see different setups is the most eye-opening thing, and knowledge sharing, because you're not going to learn if you just sat on your farm all day, and you've got to talk to other people because you might be able to implement something that they've done. And, you know, what's one thing that farmers are really good at is talking. And I think just sharing everything and getting to know and you know, looking outside of the box and thinking, okay, well, let's go look at that organic dairy. We're not organic dairy, but let's have a look at how they're doing it, because their pasture management's really good. Can we implement something here? Does that mean we can extend the grazing season a little bit more into the winter, so we don't have to, you know, if we can extend that by 30 days, that's 30 days of bedding and feeding and mucking out that we don't have to do. So there's so many factors at play, but I'm really hopeful that farming will move and be more sustainable, and more people will understand that it can be done and don't have to demonize the farmers too much for what's going on, because we all need to eat at the end of the day, don't we?
Absolutely. In your estimation, what are the biggest obstacles to running nature-friendly farm, or maybe also as a part of the same question, what are the most common mistakes that you see, you know, like when farmers try to maybe not run like a fully nature-friendly, biodiverse farm like yourself, but at least improve some things, or maybe some obstacles that they think that they're, you know, insurmountable or preventing from certain practices. But from your experience, like what were the, you know, like patterns that are emerging from your visits to different farms?
I think it's being open to understanding it takes time to get on that journey. You know, we're still, I would say, you know, since being organic, we're still evolving. There's lots of different challenges, and it's not just a like kind of overnight thing. You can make these changes, but to see, you know, biodiversity come back to the farm, and you might say, oh, well, you worry about the yields being down because if you're not spraying off or you're not ploughing, and it's going to be weedy, it's not going to be great. And I think it's just coming into it with a bit of an open mind, and again, seeing different farms and understanding their systems and what works, because there's people who are finishing cattle on a grass-based system with lots of biodiversity at a normal age. You know, they're sort of around 26, 28 months. That's, you know, the supermarket age there, and they're selling to the supermarket, and that's doing really well, and it can be done. And there's very good organic and regenerative arable farmers. And I think it is, farmers don't want the change. I know it's kind of a big statement to say, and I think they can be a little bit daunting to like just jump and try it. But it's little things that you can say, you know, let's try bale grazing for the winter, or let's try not ploughing that. Let's just bring some sheep in. Let's, you know, let the weeds grow up, bring the sheep in over the winter, start bringing stock back in, and then don't go in and plough it. Just cultivate it and drill straight in with the next year's crop. And thinking about, it's just those little changes. And I know it can be really difficult to say, let's do that. Let's actually, right, well, it's all about money at the end of the day for a lot of the farming community. You're not making a lot of money, but you want to be trying to be as self-sufficient and earn a wage and make sure that your crops and your livestock go for the best price. And I think it can be difficult to think about how you do both of them, because there's only a finite amount of time that farmers have in the day to get things done. And I think the change can be the biggest and scariest thing, but overall you just gotta do it. And, you know, there's so much support for farmers. And even if it's just changing from having a little bit of, you know, having a wildflower margin to, you know, let's do companion cropping, or let's integrate arable and livestock together. I think there's little changes that can be done, but it's just doing them. And yeah, I always talk to our neighbours about saying, oh, could you do this? Like, why don't you leave an 8 metre margin? They're like, well, why would I do that? Why would I leave the 8 metre margin? That's 8 metres, you know, that's yield, that's crops I'm not growing by having that. And it's a little bit of like, I've got my blinkers on, I'm not thinking, they're just, that's it. That you can't change them. But I do wonder if there's a bit of a generational change. You know, you've got some very good new entrants coming in, which are really driving the nature-friendly farming.
And do you see, you know, common mistakes, like people who are trying to convert and is there any pattern here? Like you would say like, hey, pay attention to this or this thing that you see most often going wrong?
I mean, you can learn from your mistakes, and that's the thing, is to really like reflect on what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. And I always try to do that with what we've done. So we went bale grazing this winter. So we lined up all the bales and we had different compartments. We were moving, they were on 2 acres every day, about 45 cows, and they were moving them on each time. And it sounds really easy and simple. Like, oh, you just, you move the electric fence, the cows move on, you roll some bales out. Simple as that. No, it's not. It really isn't. The water trough breaks, the electric fence breaks, it rains, and, it's boggy and you've got to move the cows on because it's not fair on them to be in mud. And then you think, oh, have I trashed the soil? Because the whole point of that is to keep them moving so you don't poach the ground up. And there's so much to like reflect and learn from all of that. And you just got to think, right, well, that worked and that didn't work. And think, right, how can I improve that for next year? And now I'm hoping, going forward for this winter, I think, I reduce the size down of the paddock that we're grazing, and we'll move them, twice a day, keep them moving all the time. And I think it's just reflecting on what we've learned and moving forward and thinking, okay, right, we've done that. That didn't work. How can we do it better? Or they're doing it better. Let's go talk to them and see how they're doing it, and then come back and implement that on your farm. I do quite a lot of that, pestering people, saying, you do it really well. What am I doing wrong? And it's just like, oh, well, actually, I do it this way, and that saves me half an hour. And I'm like, okay, well, that's half an hour. Then I can go do something else, isn't it? So I do.
Learning from other people's mistakes, right? Yeah. Saves a ton of time.
Definitely. There's definitely a lot of like, oh no, the neighbours are going to think I'm doing that really badly. But actually, like, we did get a few comments from the neighbours saying, what are you doing? It looks, you've absolutely trashed that bit of grassland. And I kind of wanted to bring them back in April, and when the grass had grown up and it was full of bees and all the flowers were out and the cows had gone back onto that grazing, and the difference in 4 months, or 2 months actually, when it was brown and a little bit muddy and it looked horrible, and then it was all lush and green, and I was just like, how is that the same field? But that was just because the cows were always moving and the nutrients had been incorporated from the dung and the hay that was being rolled out. And I thought, oh, it does work, and the cows looked really well for themselves, and they were fit condition, ready for calving. And I thought, that's so much better than being in the cattle shed or in a field, like with the ring feeders, and it's all muddy and horrible. And I thought, they're actually pretty happy, and I'm pretty happy that they've done really well. So that was like a kind of pat on the back moment. I'm like, yeah, I've done it. I'm really happy.
So just to wrap up the, sort of like a farm management part of this podcast, if you were in charge of a classic operation, typical mainstream operation, whether beef or dairy, lots of nitrogen inputs and the usual, and you had a task to convert that into nature-friendly, regenerative, or, whatever you want to name it, where would you start? What would be the, first 2 steps on that process?
I would say that the best tool for any farmer is your spade. To go out, have a look at your soil more than anything, because you're not going to get anywhere if your soils are depleted. If your soil organic matter's down, you're going to struggle to grow grass. You're going to struggle to grow any crops. So if you're not doing well on that front, no matter what stock you bring in, you're going to struggle. So I always love going out with the spade, having a look, if we've got any compaction, how many worms have we got? Let's have a look. So I remember being told by a farmer a couple of years ago, you're not a livestock farmer, you're a worm farmer. And I thought, what a weird saying. I was like, not a worm farmer, but actually, worms are so important. They're constantly keeping the soil cycling. And if you've got a healthy population of worms, you've got healthy soil. Healthy soil means good grass. That means good cattle. So it is a big picture. So I always say, you're building your cows from the ground up, because that's what you're reliant on. So going out with your spade, having a look, what soil type have you got? Have you got compaction issues? Look at the kind of fungi, mycorrhizal fungi that you've got going in there. Have you got, different populations of ants and worms and things? So I like to have a look at that, because then I can try and make informed decisions about, what crops potentially, do we want to keep it all as grass, or we're going to grow some arable? And then you could think about what, if you're keeping livestock, what you're going to bring in. And obviously I'm going to be a sucker and say, yeah, a native breed or a longhorn, that's what you're going to bring in. But, you know, you can make those more informed decisions and understand the kind of bigger picture of your farm and how healthy your farm is as a whole, as an ecosystem. So get out there and have a look at what is underneath in the ground and see what's growing, really. And you can go from there, I think, because we've made lots of good decisions from the farm by having a look at the soil and saying, you know, right, that's one of the reasons we stopped doing arable, is because the soil was so compacted. It needed, you know, some deep rooting crops like chicory to come in, alleviate the compaction of years and years of the combine and the tractors driving over it. That was fixed by ploughing, but then it was still happening each time. So it needed stock coming back on, and it needed a little bit of love from the soil perspective. So that's where I say to start with.
Well, absolutely. Soil is the basis for everything. I heard an expression, dung beetle farming. I presume you have a healthy dung beetle population as well on a farm.
Yeah, I actually, I love dung beetles. I get really distracted whilst I'm checking the cows. I'll easily just be like looking through the cow pads. It's a bit strange, but yeah, I mean, you can tell quite a lot. And I think I always try and encourage friends and farmers to go have a look, or like I will go have a look through their cow pads or their sheep. Because, yeah, you can tell a lot, because if, you know, you can see straight away if that animal's not been wormed or has not had any chemical inputs, because you'll see all these little holes where it's either dung beetles or it's the carrion beetles that are in it. And I had a lovely work experience student out with me yesterday, and we were having a looking through, and she's like, oh, I didn't know we had dung beetles over here. Like, didn't know at all. She just thought they were, you know, like the rollers over in Africa, the dung beetles. And I said, you know, we've got dwellers and we've got tunnelers, and we found some of the big door beetles and stuff, the ones that bury underneath the cow pat. And yeah, she was so enthusiastic about it. And I thought, oh, this is great. Not every 16-year-old would necessarily want to be delving through cow pats. But yeah, you can tell a lot, and you'll see the dung beetles flying into a fresh pat, as well as the yellow dung flies as well. So that also obviously, you know, supports the bat populations. We've got a few rare bats on the farm as well. So, you know, they're feeding that's a good population, as well as, you know, feeding the whole ecosystem from multiple different aspects from the cows. So it's helping the soil, but the dung beetles are really cool because they're breaking down that dung pat. So it's incorporated a lot quicker. So if there's cow pats that are sat on the soil and not being broken down, it means that either, you know, you haven't got dung beetles, or they're not working as well as they should, or, you know, have you wormed them recently? Is there some chemicals that are just putting them off? So we try to not put the chemicals into the cows. Occasionally we have to because of welfare reasons, but typically, yeah, you'll see all these little dung beetles come flying in, and absolutely having a great time with them. About, you know, the main reason for us is keeping stock out over winter, because you will get dung beetles throughout the winter. So it is really important to have dung all year round for your dung beetles, because we get lapwing and redwings, missel thrush come over in the winter, which will follow the cows around just specifically for the dung beetles in their cow pats. So it's all big one symbiotic relationship, looking after basically from the cows, looking after the environment, really.
I heard an opinion that use of warmers is the start of all the problems, because you're using warmers, then you don't have dung beetles, and then you need to start using multi-species sward and so on and so forth. So that's an opinion I heard, and you just confirmed that. Elise, tell me how and I'm not asking about specifics of the finance, but like a general broad stroke, you know, top contour, as they say, how the farm, which is non-intensive farm, the stocking densities are low, how do you make that commercially viable? Or maybe, you know, to ask that question, be less intrusive, is, you know, what are the approaches to make farm commercially viable with the lower stocking density, with non-intensive farming practices? So
for us, obviously being an actual England farm, I'm very honest sort of about how we farm, and that we do have a budget. I do have a set amount that I can use on the cattle each year. So that, you know, is the cost for both beef production and general running costs, you know, like your vet bill. And it's trying to make it as efficient as possible, but not to the point where it's slipping back into the more intensive style of farming. Because you think, right, you've got to get these animals fat and finished really quickly, but they're not finishing on pasture. And, the farmers got to be seen as generating income. That's why, Natural England has it. They're very keen to promote that nature-friendly farming can be done and producing a good income from the stock. So for us, it's not just relying on beef sales. So we try and do an animal sort of every other month. We're hoping to get it up. It's just balancing the workload. So we will sell that direct to customers, but we also do pedigree sales, whether that's females or bulls. So that is quite a large chunk of it. So the calves every year, ones that we know we don't need to keep for the farm and replacements, we'll sell on, and we'll market them as, these really good quality grass genetic animals. And that sort of, sells itself. People are really wanting to buy into that. So that's the kind of main avenue for the livestock. But then also we have a 30-acre field that we are in a sort of contract with the local seed company. So they come in and brush harvest that. And for yellow rattle, so it's full of yellow rattle amongst other species. And that generates a bit of farm income. We get farm income from the solar panels, but it's just trying to be a bit more diversifying and thinking about the farm as a whole, because the livestock alone does contribute to majority of the farm income. But, if we went down with, say, TB or something disastrous happened, it's thinking, actually, are we resilient as a farm business? What are the other streams of income that we're doing? So we do have to be showing that nature-friendly farming does work and we can produce quality cattle and quality beef from it. And we're still very much on that journey, but it is definitely showing that it can be done. And there's a lot of other really good quality farmers that are doing the same thing. They've got a good business, and that's on low acreage, that's on low stocking density. They're producing these animals further for beef or breeding, and it can work. So I think it's making sure that those people who are doing it really well are shouted about and you hear about them, and more people talk about it. So it is definitely getting there. Some days when you're a bit like, oh, okay, I haven't made the money that I need to. So what can we do? So we do sell some store animals. So I quite like selling to market to make sure that the Longhorn name is known. It can be easily forgotten about, a breed that's forgotten. So we'll sell to market anything that we know that we won't finish, but we'll try and finish as much beef and sell through the farm kind of beef box scheme as much as possible. So it's making a little bit of money, but that takes a lot more time and effort, and there's more kind of startup costs involved with selling beef direct off farm. But you'll see more and more of it appearing now, which is pretty good. I think people are realizing that there's money in it, and it's nice selling directly to your customer rather than it going to a supermarket. You've got that direct connection from some farm to their dinner plate, really. We're
coming to the end of this podcast slowly. I got to ask you a question as a person who is very versed in farming with nature, biodiversity, conservation, all this good stuff. What are your views on rewilding? Broad strokes. What I'm specifically asking about is conflict with farmers, potential losses of livestock to carnivores, and so on. So what are your views? Is this something that definitely has a future, something that is not needed, and we have more to fix before we bring wolves and lynx and so on? Where you're at?
I think rewilding does have a place in the UK for sure, and it's really interesting and exciting to see the rewilding projects that have done particularly well already. I do think it's a word that's quite demonized in farming, especially when a lot of farms are being bought and then either go to solar farms or being planted up. And that's, I think, is this whole kind of land sparing, land sharing at the moment. And for me, it's trying to meet in the middle. It's sad to see farms being bought up and just planted, and it's not like it's going into native woodland. It's forestry, or it's going the other way, and it's really intensive livestock farming. So the somewhere in the middle, I think we need to meet, and rewilding definitely has its place. I think, it's amazing seeing beavers back and how they are really changing habitats and being proper ecosystem engineers and helping alleviate flooding. But at the end of the day, it's always the farm's got to think, right, how does that affect me? How does that affect my livelihood? Is that going to flood my farm? Do farmers need to be paid for having their farm flooded? There's lots of hurdles that still need overcoming. And I think it is a daunting prospect to say, we want to reintroduce lynx and wolves. I think it is exciting that they could be here, but the UK is so small, and there's very little wilderness, proper true wilderness in the UK, apart from sort of, the Highlands of Scotland. And then it comes back to the land sparing and land sharing. Do we need to think about getting our farmlands linked up with more nature reserves and thinking about the general connectivity of habitats before anything else? We need to get, landowners, land managers, conservation organisations and farmers all on board about linking up, because it's no good having really biodiverse, for us, being a honeypot of a nature reserve surrounded by some arable. We need to link up, because that's not creating a connective habitat for animals and species to move. So I'm a real advocate for that. And I think, species will evolve and appear. And I do think, rewilding in areas is really important. And it's great to see farmer clusters linking up and talking. And that's like big landscape scales. You're talking thousands of acres. And I like the collaborative approach towards it. And I think it's just, we've got to start with the people who are managing it first. And rewilding, it can be difficult. And I think there's a lot of space for nature on farms that needs to happen first, more than anything. Is getting all the farmers on board and saying, right, we'll look at the other farmers that are doing it already. So let's see how they're doing it and what we can implement for them. And, you make space for nature and nature will appear, won't it? So, and I love farmers when they get excited about it. They're like, oh, I've seen a yellowhammer, or I've got corn buntings and the little things. And I'm like, yeah, let's get more of them. Come on, you're doing something good. Let's really hone in on it and get more of them. So, yeah.
That's for sure. Elise, thank you so much. It's been pleasure talking with you.
No, thank you so much.